All right, guys, we'll be starting our next session. He is the #1 New York Times best-selling author. He's an Eisner Award-winning author and a Tony Award-winning producer of Broadway shows, film, television, graphic novels. He is the producer and writer of The Fifth Beatle, a critically acclaimed, multiple award-winning #1 New York Times best-selling graphic novel based on the untold life story of Beatles manager Brian Epstein. The Fifth Beatle has won both the Eisner and Harvey Awards, making it an undisputed champion among the works done in comics and graphics arts medium this year. Also, he serves as the board of directors for Valiant Entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Vivek Tiwary!
It says November 19th, but that was November 19th in the US last year. So the book is actually just came out here in India. Random House India does have it at their booth. And now I'm going to get started with some slides. Okay, hello everyone. So the story of the Fifth Beatle begins in Liverpool in 1961. But my story begins hundreds of years before that here in India, because that's where my family is from. My father is from UP, and my mother's side of the family is half from Bihar and half from Rajasthan. Although you would probably be forgiven for looking at me and saying, he's not really one of us. I'm sure I look like a New Yorker, and I know I sound like a New Yorker. So maybe I don't totally fit in here. And you know what? Back home in New York, I don't totally fit in there either. When I start talking like this, my friends in New York sometimes say that I'm an ABCD, an American-born confused Desi. So if I don't fit in New York, and I don't really fit in India, well, where do I fit in? Well, I tell you what, I feel like I fit in here at Hyderabad Comic Con. It's true. I look out at the crowd and I see all these Indian fanboys and fangirls, and I'm like, this is my people. I really feel so at home here. It's been awesome to be here. It really is a joy and an honor. So thank you, all of you, for inviting me to come and party with you this weekend. It's been awesome. So who am I, really, and why should you listen to me? So my name is Vivek Tiwary, and I am the author of The Fifth Beatle, a graphic novel based on the life of Brian Epstein. The book, as I said, came out in the US a little less than a year ago. It just came out in India. Random House India does have copies of it here, and I'd be happy to sign one for you if you want to buy one. We're also giving away posters. The book's done incredibly well in the United States. It won the Will Eisner Comic Award. It won 2 Harvey Awards. It's a New York Times bestseller. I'm incredibly proud of it, and I'm going to talk more about that for the next 40 minutes or so and show you some images from the book as we speak. And I'm also happily a Broadway producer. My shows have won 25 Tony Awards, over 44 Tony nominations. Thank you. My last couple shows were Green Day's American Idiot and the Addams Family. Thank you so much. And finally, I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit organization in America called Musicians on Call. We bring musicians into healthcare institutions to perform for patients. And the organization is 15 years old, and we've been supported by everybody from Bruce Springsteen to Britney Spears. Thank you. I am incredibly proud of the work that I've done in entertainment. I love what I do on a day-to-day basis, and I can tell you that I am just getting warmed up. However, for me, none of that was supposed to happen. As I mentioned, my family's from India, and like most Indian parents, my parents expected me to join the family business and sell food products or financial securities. And if I wasn't going to do that, then I was expected to become a doctor or an engineer or enter fields like technology or maybe the law. But those weren't the things that I was passionate about. I certainly wasn't expected to write comic books and produce punk rock albums. That is crazy talk. But those were my dreams. So where in God's name did I find the inspiration to pursue those dreams despite what my family wanted to do? Well, that story is the Brian Epstein story, and that story starts in Liverpool in 1961. It's also a story that starts when a gay Jew walks into a bar. Now, Liverpool in 1961 was a very dangerous place for gay Jews like Brian Samuel Epstein. If you were gay, you got beaten up or thrown in jail. Being gay was illegal. If you were Jewish, you faced daily taunts from constant anti-Semitism. Jews were very disliked in the country. And the bar was a dirty basement rock club where kids were dressed in drainpipe jeans and leather jackets, gathered to see a rock band play. And Brian Epstein didn't even like rock and roll music. To make matters worse, he was wearing his favorite outfit, an elegant pinstripe suit. To say that Brian Epstein was a fish out of water would have been putting it mildly. Nevertheless, what sounds like the setup for a truly tasteless joke turned out to be the beginning of a revolution. Because that night, Brian Epstein saw the Beatles. And they were nothing special. They spent most of their sets smoking, drinking, and goofing around with the audience. They barely played any songs. It's true that the audience loved them, but that's mostly because they were made up of friends and classmates. The Beatles had also exhausted whatever little opportunity Liverpool had for a developing band. They had even gone over to Hamburg, where they did a stint in Germany, and they literally got kicked out of the country, returned to Liverpool, having lost their then bass player, Stu Sutcliffe, to a girl. He stayed behind for a girl. Basically, the Beatles had hit a ceiling, and it was low. They were the biggest bunch of losers that Brian Epstein had ever laid his eyes on. However, when they decided to show a little bit of professionalism and actually play some music, Brian Epstein was enchanted. You can see it in his face from that panel in the book. Brian heard in the Beatles a band that had a great message of love to share with the world. And he thought that that was a worthy message. As a gay man in the 1960s who literally had to hide his own love away, the idea of devoting himself to something where he could spread some love into the world, a message of love, was very appealing. He walked out of the Cavern Club that night with big dreams. He said the Beatles are going to be bigger than Elvis. They're going to elevate pop music into an art form, whatever that means. People laughed at it. They laughed at him as if it was the punchline to that truly tasteless joke. They said he was crazy. They said that dream is stupid, and they said people like you don't do things like that. But of course, the joke would be on all of them, because within 4 years, Brian Epstein would ignore all the people who told him he couldn't do it and told him that his dreams were stupid, and the world got the Beatles, the biggest pop culture phenomenon probably that has ever happened. Now, I discovered this story when I was in business school, when I was on track to join my parents in their family business, something that I was terrified about doing because it wasn't what I was passionate about. I was passionate in the arts and entertainment, and I was dying to find a way to break into that field. I wasn't finding in my studies any way to learn about that stuff, and being a lifelong Beatles fan, I took it on myself. I thought they were the group that wrote and then rewrote the rules of the pop music business, so I thought I should study the life of Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. basically what happened was when I couldn't find in my life a living, breathing mentor, I found the Brian Epstein story. He died in 1967 and I was born in 1973, so I never got to meet him. But what I do is I call him my historical mentor, somebody whose life I've strived to learn from. And I've spent the last 20 years meticulously researching this guy's life in an effort to learn everything I can from how he chased his dreams. And it wasn't always easy. The Fifth Beatle is the only book in print about Brian Epstein, graphic novel or otherwise. So when you rewind 20 years ago, which is when I began my studies, not only is there no books on Brian Epstein, there's no Wikipedia, there's no YouTube, there's no Google. So the only thing I could do was do interviews. I got my hands on every respected Beatles book that I could find, and I read these 300-page books about the Beatles that would have maybe 5 or 10 pages about Brian Epstein. And slowly, I painted a picture in my head of the people who knew him best. And then I pulled out what at the time was the most cutting-edge piece of technology. It was about this big. It was called the phone book. I pulled a phone book off of my shelf, and I looked up the names and numbers of people who knew Brian Epstein, who lived within driving distance of New York City, which was home, and Philadelphia, where I was at school. And I cold called them. And I said, I'm a young person looking for more information about Brian Epstein. The little bit I know about him is inspiring, and I'm trying to learn more. I was so excited about reaching out to these people that I forgot to be intimidated. And do you know what? Not one of them turned me away. People like Sid Bernstein, who was the legendary concert promoter that brought the Beatles over to the United States for the first time. Sid, apart from being a legendary concert promoter, was also Jewish. So he was able to illuminate for me the business of the Beatles, you know, how they came over to the United States, but also he was able to illuminate the struggles that he and Brian faced as Jews working in the entertainment industry in the 1960s. I also met people like Nat Weiss, who was the Beatles' U.S. attorney and became Brian Epstein's closest confidant. Nat also could illuminate a number of business issues about the Beatles, but Nat was also gay. While he and Brian were never lovers, he could illuminate a lot of Brian Epstein's struggles as a gay man in the 1960s. And slowly these people opened up to me over the years, and I'm very proud to say a number of them became my friends. And the stories that they wound up telling me over the past 20 years were astounding. And I'm going to share one of them with you today, and there are many more in the book. So the story I'm going to share with you today starts off in 1963, on Christmas Day. In America, on Christmas Day, virtually no one has heard of the Beatles. A month and a half later, on February 9th, 1964, 73 million Americans tuned in to the Ed Sullivan Show to see the Beatles perform. Now, how did that happen? Well, it happened because Brian Epstein noticed that the hot Christmas present on December 25th, 1963, in the United States, was the transistor radio. It's a small device, not much bigger than your cell phone, and it was the first time that kids could take their music with them. Prior to that, you had to listen to music at home in front of a big radio, big piece of furniture, and you had to listen to it with your parents or your kid brother. But now all of a sudden, with the transistor radio, you could take your music with you. You could listen to it at school, in the locker room, or after school, and equally importantly, you could listen with your friends. This marked a sea change in the consumption of music amongst the youth. 1963 was also the year that the transistor radio became so cheap to manufacture that it was very easy to get one, and every teenager in America wanted one, and they all got them in their stockings for Christmas. So Brian Epstein realized that there was a sea change coming in music amongst the youth. He also realized that there was going to be a greater importance on the DJs who were talking to the youth on those transistor radio. People like New York City's Murray the K. Now these DJs were people who were largely ignored by the traditional media. But Brian saw with the transistor radio they were going to be very, very important, and very important to the Beatles. So he endeared himself and the Beatles to these DJs, to the extent that he leaked their flight information when the band was coming over from Liverpool to the United States. He told the DJs on one condition: you have to tell your audience when the band is arriving at JFK, and you have to tell them to come out to the airport to see the band. Tell them to come. Tell them to bring their friends. Tell them to tell their friends about it and pass it on. It was the 1964 equivalent of tweeting it. It went right over the heads of the adults and the traditional media, even though it was happening in public. It was exactly like tweets, and it worked. Thousands of kids came out to the airport, shocking the adults and the traditional media. But then Brian Epstein did a really disruptive thing. He decided to throw the press conference for the Beatles at the airport. Who throws press conferences at airports? Press conferences are typically held in hotels or conference centers, places like this. You don't hold a press conference at an airport. But by bringing out the traditional media to the airport to see the thousands of kids that descended on JFK to see the Beatles perform, Brian Epstein turned what should have been a simple arrival of 4 provincial Liverpool guys in a band into a crazy media frenzy. 0 to 73 million in 2.5 months. In 1.5 months. It's incredibly inspiring stuff. And I could talk to you for hours with stories like that of things that he did for the Beatles. But it's funny, for me, the most inspiring thing about the Brian Epstein story, the stories that I learned that most moved me, actually had very little to do with the Beatles. They were really stories about his personal life. Now, I mentioned that Brian was gay. It's very, very hard to imagine what that was like in the 1960s in the United Kingdom. Being gay was illegal. It was against the law. If 2 men or 2 women were seen holding hands walking down the street, they would have been thrown in jail. Here is a guy that dedicated his entire life to spreading a message of love around the world, and he died at the age of 32, never having had a proper boyfriend, never having really fallen in love himself. Brian was also at the end of his life seeing the best doctors in the world because he could afford them and he had access to them, and they were prescribing pills to cure him of his homosexuality. Pills that would eventually lead to his death of an accidental overdose of prescription pills at the young age, as I mentioned, of 32. It's very tragic. I also mentioned that Brian Epstein was Jewish. Now, it's also kind of hard to imagine Jews not working in the entertainment industry because they're so prevalent there today. But the truth is, in the 1960s, especially in the United Kingdom, Jews just did not work in the music industry. The music industry in the UK was run by people like Sir Lou Grade and Sir Joseph Lockwood. They were older, Christian, white knights of the British Empire. It wasn't run by young people with last names like Epstein. Times have certainly changed, but that was the case back then. And finally, Brian Epstein was from Liverpool. Liverpool was a port town that had strategic importance as a shipping destination, but otherwise had no cultural influence whatsoever. So in Brian Epstein, you literally have a 26-year-old gay Jew running around a dirty port town in the north of England saying, I found a local rock and roll band, and they're going to be bigger than Elvis. They're going to elevate, will be why he deserves that title. Thank you. Because you see, for me, every time I've made a step in my career where I was nervous, scared to death of that next step, every time somebody told me, you can't do that, it can't be done, Indians don't do that, Indians don't work in that field. Every time that happened to me, I would just close my eyes and I would think about that gay Jew who walked into a bar. And I would smile because I knew the joke's not on me, it's on all the disbelievers. I am here to ask you to believe. If I can leave you with anything, it is this. The message of the Brian Epstein story is that no dream is too impossible and no person too unlikely to realize that dream. If you have a dream and you chase it with passion and persistence and you're willing to work your tail off, you can reach that impossible dream. It doesn't matter what your parents want you to do. It doesn't matter what the world wants you to do. And you know what? If you say that I can't find a mentor, I can't find somebody to help me, well, that's no excuse. Turn to history the way I did. Our history is rich with inspiration. For me, it was Brian Epstein. I can't tell you who it'll be for you. If you want to work in politics, in some field, and you're told that Indians don't work in that area of politics, well, maybe you should meticulously study the life of Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if you know much about Abraham Lincoln, but he ran for president of the United States 4 times before he was elected. People said he was crazy, his ideas were too radical. But just like Brian Epstein, he chased his dream with passion and persistence. And we're all people of color here, so I'm sure you can appreciate how grateful we are that he did that. He changed the face of America because of that. It's an amazing story. If you are a young woman who is into a certain form of athletics, a certain sport, and you're told that that's a sport for men, that women don't operate in that field, and you can't find a fellow woman or someone in India to help you with that, well, you know what? Maybe you should study the life of Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was told that women would never fly, and she literally soared, broke all sorts of aviation records. These people are out there, they're in our history, and especially today when there's resources like the internet and Wikipedia, it's not hard the way it was for me to research the life of somebody who can inspire you to do the things that you want to do. Find yourself a historical mentor. The best thing about historical mentors is that they're dead. They can't say no. They can't tell you they don't have time for you. Of course, the hard thing about a historical mentor is that they're dead. And you have to spend a lot of time researching their life. It's not easy. I spent 20 years on the Brian Epstein story. Nothing about chasing your dreams is easy. It sounds very poetic, but it's very difficult. However, it'll never, ever feel like work. It took me 20 years to research this story. It took me 10 years to put the Fifth Beatle together. We're also adapting it into a film right now. The film, I wrote the screenplay, and it's going to shoot next year. Thank you so much. I hope in 2016, which is when I think it'll come out, we can have a premiere in India, and I'll see all you guys there. Thank you. But, you know, one of the very exciting things about the film is that we secured Beatles music rights. We got the approval of Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Yoko Ono, and Olivia Harrison. Paul McCartney wrote me a letter saying how much he loved the Fifth Beatle and loved the artwork and loved the way we were treating Brian Epstein. Awesome, right? That took me 3.5 years to get those music rights. 3.5 years. And you know what? People could say like, oh my gosh, what an obstacle. That must have been so difficult. That must have been so hard. It must have been so stressful. You know what? Like, it's a matter of perspective, I think, because none of those things felt like challenges. To me, they felt like a game. It was an opportunity. I loved what I did. So every day I would have to go into work and try to find a way to get to Paul McCartney. How cool is that? What a great way to spend my day, trying to talk to the Beatles, trying to research ways to get Ringo Starr to like my book. Like, that's not work, that's fun. When there was a detail in Brian Epstein's life that I didn't understand, and one person would say he did this, and one person would say he never did that, and I had to research it, so what, I have to fly out to Liverpool and go to famous Beatles locations and interview people who knew the Beatles? Like, how lucky am I? Like, these things, if you love the dream that you are chasing, it will never feel like work. But it won't be easy. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy, but it will be incredibly rewarding. And it will, despite being difficult, be incredibly fun. So before I turn it over to questions, I'm just going to say it again. I know I talk a lot, so you'd be forgiven if you zoned out. So I said it before, I'm going to say it again in case you missed it. The message of the Brian Epstein story: no dream is too impossible and no person too unlikely to realize that impossible dream. I ask you to please believe that in your heart, and you can accomplish anything. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to open it up to questions about anything, about the Fifth Beatle, about my theater work.
While you were researching about Brian Epstein, were you working as well?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, you know, I did research this book for 20 years, and it would be impractical to think that, you know, that was all that I was doing for the past 20 years, you know. And it's an excellent question. You know, when my parents wanted me to pursue business and to work in our family business was in finance and in food products. And you know what I did? I went to business school and I got a business degree. My parents weren't wrong, you know. And I'm a dad now myself, and I appreciate that you want the best for your kids, you know. So what I did is I did a bit of both, you know. I had to have a job and worked and do other things while chasing my dreams. You know, but what I felt that I was doing on a day-to-day basis was researching the Brian Epstein story and chasing my dreams while simultaneously working in other fields and doing other things. Somewhere along the way, my theater project started to take off. And at that moment, I was able to focus entirely on the arts and entertainment and not be doing anything outside of that field. But there's no question that in the early days, I didn't drop out of business school to chase a dream in the arts. I completed my degree, and I'm glad I did. I want to say that my parents weren't wrong, but at its core, I had to follow my own dreams.
Hi, Vivek. This is Jatin here. Just like to appreciate. This is Jatin here.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. First, like to appreciate your efforts and the message you have passed on to us.
Sorry, I can't hear. I don't know why I'm not hearing you.
Hi, this is Jatin here. Hello. So first of all, I like to appreciate the effort and the message that you're passing on to us.
Thank you.
And my question is, since I didn't know much about the Fifth Beatle at all, Googled a bit and I found there was a lot of controversies around the Fifth Beatle. Even the Beatles themselves have controversy as to who should get the title of Fifth Beatle, and with only Paul McCartney mentioning that the Brian Epstein should be called the Fifth Beatle. So did you face any obstacles or constraints or concerns from the Beatles themselves as to why do you want to take Brian Epstein's story as the Fifth Beatle?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question was, did I face any concerns, especially from the Beatles themselves, over giving the title "The Fifth Beatle" to Brian Epstein? I didn't. In fact, my research suggests that the Beatles themselves felt that way about Brian. It's true that a number of people have laid claim to the title "The Fifth Beatle" over the years. George Martin, their record producer, has often been called the Fifth Beatle. Pete Best, who was the band's drummer before Ringo, has been called the Fifth Beatle. I mentioned the New York City DJ Murray the K earlier. Murray the K was actually the guy who created the term "the Fifth Beatle." When he was on his radio show, he said, "This is Murray the K, the Fifth Beatle, coming at you from New York City." So he was actually the guy that created the title. So yes, there's been a lot of people, a lot of fans who think various people deserve the title "the Fifth Beatle." I'm going with Brian Epstein. Paul McCartney very famously said, if anyone was the Fifth Beatle, it was Brian. And that's a great quote, and I slap it on the back of all of our marketing materials. But the quote is actually a little bit longer. That's what he said, and then he goes on to say, a lot of people talk about George Martin being the Fifth Beatle or others being the Fifth Beatle. But the truth is, Brian Epstein was the guy that was there from the beginning. When people like George Martin came into the band was already fully formed. They had suits and haircuts, they were professional, they knew what they were doing. When Brian came into the Beatles, he was like a band member. The band were scruffy and rough and tumble, and no one cared about them. So that's what being in a band is really like. It's like that's where you're there from the very, very beginning. And that's, I think, why he deserves the title "The Fifth Beatle," and why ultimately I think the Beatles did too. There's a line in the book where Brian says to the Beatles, "You focus on your art." Part of his management strategy was that the band should just focus on their art. They shouldn't worry about the business. And what he said is, you play your instruments, and I will play the business like it's my instrument. And that's really what he did. He manipulated the business to allow the Beatles to push boundaries. And the business was his instrument. He was a fifth member of the band, and his instrument was the business. Anything else?
I'm going home with him. He has all my copies.
Hey Vivek.
Hello.
Am I audible?
What's that?
Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, good. Did you get a chance to personally meet any of the Beatles?
I did. That's been really one of the very cool things about this project is the researching and the interviewing. I met Ringo years and years before this. Before I started my own company, I worked for Mercury Records in New York City, and Ringo Starr was on Mercury Records for a period of time. He had an album called Vertical Man that I had an opportunity to work on. So I actually got a chance to work with Ringo on one of his records. So by the time, years later, I was working on the Fifth Beatle, I wouldn't say that we were friends or anything like that, but he had some memory of who I was, and there was some goodwill there already. Paul McCartney was a little bit harder to get to, or a lot harder to get to, I should say. He gets a million requests all the time. So again, as I said earlier, when I was chasing the music rights, it took me 3.5 years. So it took a while, but finally, Paul, I was able to give him the book. He spoke very warmly about Brian, and then he wrote me a letter afterwards after he had read it and said how much he loved it, which was an amazing day in my life. I should say it wasn't a letter, it was an email. And I will tell you, it came at the end of a week when a bunch of cool things happened for the Fifth Beatle. I think we got like nominated for an award at the beginning of the week. I think later that week something cool happened for the film. And then at the end of the week I got this email from Paul McCartney, and I literally thought that it was one of my friends playing a prank on me. I was like, which friend is pulling my leg, you know? And it had to be my publicist reach out to me, and she was like, no, that's a real email from Paul McCartney. So it was pretty awesome. And that's why I said, like, you know, these things might sound like work, but it's not work. All this stuff has been such a joy for me.
Hi Vivek, I'm Krishna.
Hello.
I would like to know what's the experience now that you scripted into the movie? How different is it from the graphic novel?
How different is the question was how different is the movie from the graphic novel? And I would say very. You know, in my mind, I love comics. I should say I probably learned to read by reading comics. My parents both loved comics, and I used to read Tintin books with my mom. In America we say Tintin, but it was my mom said Tintin with the European pronunciation. So I adore the medium of comics. You know, I wrote the Fifth Beatle as a graphic novel because I believe that the graphic novel medium allows you to capture emotions in a way that a prose book really never could. You know, I could have written a 300-page book about the Beatles, but honestly, like, who's going to read that? You know, some of you might. I would have. You know, Beatles fans will. But you know, if you see the book, you'll see it's thin. It's 128 pages. If you flip through it, you'll see how beautiful the artwork is. And you know, it's the kind of thing you could pick it up at an airplane bookstore and think, oh, I could finish this before my flight is over. You know, and I wanted that. I wanted to be able to potentially pick up casual readers, because my goal with this story is to sing the unsung song of Brian Epstein. You know, it's a story that really inspired my life and that I believe can inspire others. I'm going to, just as a quick aside, again say how awesome it is to be at Hyderabad Comic Con. Really, it's awesome because the Brian Epstein story inspired me when I was a young Indian person who was not on this track to do that, you know. And so I think if I can come back to India, come to India Comic Cons and spread that message to potentially other Indian people who might feel the same way about their dreams, then I'm doing good work with my life. So those are some of the reasons why I chose the graphic novel medium. I also think that you know, a lot has been written, for example, about the night that Brian Epstein first sees the Beatles. We talked about this slide earlier. You know, and I will argue that and I'm the writer, I'm not the artist, so I'm not complimenting myself. But I think this artwork is incredible, and I think you can learn more about what that night felt to Brian Epstein by looking at that piece of art, at the look on his face. You know, I talked about how it filled him with hope and possibility. I think you can see it there in a way that you never could in a prose book. So that's why I chose the graphic novel medium. Now, film. You know, I want to be very clear about graphic novels because I love comics, you know. I did not make a graphic novel in order to make a film. Some people do that. They really want to make a film, so they make a comic book and hope that it'll become a film. I think those projects are doomed. You know, I think in anything you do in the arts, you have to do it with passion and truth. And if you're making something because you really want to be making something else, then that project is going to fail. So I want to be very clear, I didn't make this book in order to make a film. From the very beginning, I saw them as two individual projects. When I started to think about telling the Brian Epstein story, I saw the story in terms of colors. It starts off in Liverpool in 1961. You know, I showed you this is the first page of the book. And so I saw Liverpool in 1961 as being very dark, gray, drab, rainy. It's a little bit depressed. In my mind, it felt very black and white. And you can see we kind of played with that. It's black, white, gray, blue. It's very monotone. The story ends in 1967 London, which is the birth of the psychedelic era. It's the summer of love. There's literally an event in London that year called A Technicolor Dream. So in my mind, the story is the movement from black and white to Technicolor. The Brian Epstein story mirrors that arc. And to me, the two mediums that most powerfully utilize color in their narrative are books, or graphic novels, comics, and film. Now, obviously, the one thing that film can do that a book can't is sing. You know, the graphic novel, I think Andrew Robinson, the artist, did a wonderful job at that page I showed you earlier. You can almost hear the band playing, but you can't really, right? You know, maybe one day there'll be digital graphic novels that can incorporate sound, and I think that's an exciting place that the medium's heading. But right now, books are static, you know? So what I wanted to do, the main reason I wanted to make a film, outside of being able to play with color in certain ways that I couldn't in the book, is sound. You know, I wanted when you get to that cavern scene, I wanted you to hear what Brian heard. You know, so that's why also chasing those music rights for 3.5 years were critical. So the way that I describe the film, and I know this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but I wanted to give you guys kind of the background on the project. But the way that I describe the film is that it's an expansion of what's done in the graphic novel. You'll see some stories in the film that aren't in the graphic novel at all. The story of Pete Best, who was the band's first drummer, is not in the graphic novel. It is in the film. The story of Brian and his father, they had a very complicated relationship, is only sort of hinted at in the graphic novel. I delve into it much more deeply in the film. So to me, as a writer, the film was an opportunity. I wrote the screenplay, so the film was an opportunity for me to tread more ground, to cover certain things that I couldn't in the book, in the film. And you'll see in the film, there are certain things that are in the book that were left out of the film. So I didn't want the two things to be like, well, you know, if you've read the book, then you've already seen the film. I wanted to like complete the picture about Brian Epstein. If you're interested in Brian Epstein, if you think he's fascinating, then you should read the book and see the film, and you'll get a broader picture of it. And that was my feeling. You know, when I'm asked briefly if I'm in an elevator, I'll say we're adapting it into a film because that's easy to understand. But the truth is, it's less of an adaptation and more of an expansion. That's the way I think of it.
Hey Vivek.
Hey.
So I've just read the book and it's brilliant, really.
Thank you.
And what I wanted to ask you is, you said that this was a project over 20 years and it wasn't easy. As you said, he was an outsider at that time. And so how difficult was it for you? Because everybody's not going to say good things about him. So how difficult was it for you, to make out what is true, what is false? As there was no Wikipedia, there was no Google. So how do you make that?
Yeah, the question was, you know, over the years of research, some people will say nice things about him, some people will say bad things about him. You know, how do you figure out what? How do you figure out what's real, what's not real? And this is actually, you know, this is the question, the major issue about any biographer. You know, if you're telling a true story or you're studying somebody's life, it's like, who do you believe? Because memories, people have different memories. Sometimes people have agendas and they dislike someone, and so they speak badly about them and they say things that are untrue. Sometimes they're being truthful. It's just like as you get older, your memory of certain things changes, you know. And there were enough, and this is true with the Beatles in general. I mean, if you ever have a chance to go to Liverpool, you'll see everyone over a certain age in Liverpool has a Beatles story. Everyone went to school with John Lennon. Everyone knew George Harrison. And it's like, it's half true because Liverpool is a small town, but it can't all be true. It can't be like everybody who's 70 years old was a buddy of John Lennon's, you know? So this is really the challenge that every biographer faces. And at the end of the day, the best that you can do is talk to everyone. Really, just talk to everyone and then decide for yourself. You know, hopefully you'll talk to 10 people, and if 8 of the 10 people say one thing and 2 people say another thing, maybe you go with the 8 because more people said it, so you think it must be more true. Or after a while, you know who to believe. You know, like Nat Weiss was Brian's best friend and closest confidant, and he felt very believable to me. Nat was also an attorney, and telling the truth, even when it was difficult, was very important to Nat. And with Nat, there were moments when he would say something that was not complimentary. He would say, here's something about Brian that I didn't like, or that wasn't very cool, or something that Brian did that wasn't very nice. And I could see that it was hard for Nat to tell me that, because he was Brian's friend. But when he did that, he gained my trust. And I believed, okay, this guy's going to be honest, so I'll trust him more than I'll trust somebody else. And that's ultimately what you have to do. As a writer, you just have to do as much research as you can and decide for yourself what's true. And that's also kind of the joy of writing, you know, is doing that research. And that's what makes your work unique. Because at the end of the day, this is certainly the Fifth Beatle as told by Vivek Tiwary. You know what I mean? It is my book, and so this is my take on it. So.
Do you play an instrument yourself?
So I grew up playing a little bit of drums and percussion, and I did take tabla for a little while. I learned very quickly that people who play tabla start when they're like, 2 years old and do this for 5 years before moving on to the next. I had no patience for it. I was terrible. So I laugh when you ask the question because my answer would be no. I respect the instrument of tabla and drums too much to say that I'm a drummer. I messed around in high school and college, and I did play in a band. I wasn't very good. I was okay. I was much better behind the scenes, writing about it and producing. So. But it was fun. It was great fun to be in a band.
I'll make one more question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there are good things and there are bad things that came out of your research. And since it's your take on his life, you've been inspired by his life.
Yeah.
And we generally see in biopics, it's the person who's doing the biopic or doing the writing the one. It's the bias sort of comes in. So if you're like, if you're in awe of Brian, you would write more of good things about him than highlight the bad ones. How did?
Yeah, you have to balance it. I mean, clearly, I'm sure this isn't going to be a surprise to anybody that I'm a Brian Epstein fanatic. You know, I mean, I love the Brian Epstein story. He was a hero of mine, and so certainly that will come across in the book. However, he was a flawed and imperfect hero. And I get that. In fact, let me take it back. I said that I was a fanatic. I'm not a fanatic. You know, that's where the word fan comes from. And I say this very, very carefully. I'm not a Brian Epstein fan. Brian Epstein was my historical mentor, right? And I know this is very nerdy of me, but I use the word mentor very carefully. You know, because a mentor is somebody who you learn from, right? And you learn what to do and what not to do. There were a lot of things Brian Epstein did that weren't great. Like he did have a lot of people in his life that loved him. Granted, he was gay at a time where it was illegal, so it was harder for him. But I don't think he made enough time in his life for the people that loved him. You know, I'm having the time of my life here in Hyderabad, and unfortunately, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. My flight leaves at 7:15 a.m. to go back to New York City. Why am I leaving so early? I'm leaving because I have two kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and if I leave at 7:15 in the morning, I'll be home by 5:30 New York time, and I'll be able to put my kids to sleep. You know, that's something that Brian Epstein probably wouldn't have done. He probably would have stayed and worked harder and, tried to get the word, but I want to do both. You know, I'll stay here all night. I'll be at my table. Anybody who wants to talk to me, I will stay until the doors close to talk. But then in the morning, I'm going home to my kids because I love my kids too. You know, so that's something that Brian didn't do so well. Thank you. So you do have to put both. And I feel if I didn't put both, who would believe me, right? The story wouldn't feel real. You know, it would be like, nobody is is all good. You know, human beings are black and white. You know, so I think as a writer, you have to portray both sides. If you don't, your piece won't have any color to it. It won't feel real. It's a true story, you know? I mean, Brian dies at the age of 32. He dies of an accidental overdose of prescription pills. He never fell in love. He never had a boyfriend. It's pretty tragic, right? But for me, the story is incredibly inspiring. So how do I reconcile those two things? I talk about the ending of the book. I think it's tragic. If I've done my job as a writer, I hope when you read at the end, the ending is very sad. But to me, the fact that there's a tragic ending makes it more real. You know, if it had a happy ending, it would be like, who's going to believe that? Who's going to believe that this guy accomplished all this crazy stuff by the age of 28 and it has a happy ending? It's like, that doesn't happen in real life. You know, real life is balanced. So the fact that he did all this amazing stuff, but there's also a deep tragedy to it, makes it feel real. It makes it feel more human to me. And it's true. It is a true story. But even if I was a writer making the story up, I would want to do that. I would want to give it that kind of balance and depth to make it feel real. Anything else? I think this guy wants to ask something. It seems like we have plenty of time, so we can go back to you. I'm sorry. Can you say it in the mic?
Who would you like to see an actor portray
Who as an actor? Yeah, so we are casting the film, or we're about to start casting the film in the next coming months. Over at my table, we have a mailing list, an email list, a sign-up sheet, so I can keep you posted on film news if anyone wants to sign that list. I should also say that I'm going to give away a copy of the book, so if you sign the list, you can also enter to win a copy of the book. But we are casting right now. I can't tell you who we're talking to because we're in the middle of some conversations with some people. I can't say because I'm talking to some of the guys who are our dream guys. But I will tell you this: Brian Epstein dies at the age of 32. So for most of the film, he's in his mid-20s, and we are starting with British actors because he obviously was British. It doesn't mean that an American or North American actor couldn't do it. I tend to think that Brits do American accents better than Americans do British. So we're starting with British actors. So if you think of the young British actors who are fanboy friendly, shall we say, you can probably start putting a list together. You know, folks like Benedict Cumberbatch, folks like Andrew Garfield, Tom Hiddleston. Nicholson, Eddie Redmayne, Dominic Cooper, Charlie Cox. I mean, there's a number of these wonderful young actors who would be very right for the part. Who would you like to see play Brian Epstein? Martin Freeman. Interesting. I actually, you know what? I'm gonna give you a piece of non-news news. I will say that it's not going to be Benedict Cumberbatch, and I'll actually tell you a very quick story about this. So I've obviously been working on this for a very, very long time, and there was a period where I went out to actors before we had music rights. You know, I just was trying to get an actor attached, and I actually met Benedict. Benedict was very interested in this role, and he actually read for it for me. Now, this was a time when Benedict was well known in the UK, in his home country, but no one knew about him anywhere else in the world. He hadn't done Sherlock, he certainly hadn't done Star Trek or any of that stuff. And literally, he really wanted the part. And when I came back to America, I couldn't get anyone in the film business or my investors or anybody to care about Benedict Cumberbatch. It's one of those crazy Hollywood stories where I would mention the name and they thought I was like, Benedict Cumberbatch? What a ridiculous name. They thought I was making it up. You know, and of course, a number of years later, he's like an incredibly hot and successful and very difficult to get actor. So when we are now at the stage that we are casting, we actually did reach out back to Benedict because there was a time where he was interested, and he and I wouldn't say he's a friend, but we remained friendly over the years. And he was actually at one point attached to there was going to be another Brian Epstein film, and I'd heard that he was doing that. And so I actually reached out to him then, and I said, if you're doing that, like, good luck. You know, I don't believe in competition. The more people who care about Brian Epstein, the better. And the New York Times wrote this article about how there were competing Epstein projects, dueling biopics. But it wasn't true. We were all friendly. And anyway, I heard that project fell apart. They didn't get Beatles music rights. They didn't get the cooperation of Brian's family. So that project went away. And I reached back out to Benedict, and I said, if you're still interested in Brian Epstein, if you still care about the project, we are going to start casting. And he confirmed that other project isn't happening, but he also said that he's moved on. He's no longer interested in this subject. So it wasn't about the role. He just doesn't want to play Brian anymore. So it's not going to be Benedict Cumberbatch. But there are a number of other very great British actors who could be right for it.
One more question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot about how Brian's inspiration and he was your historical mentor and all. You totally into the project. But I also would like to understand how much of your qualification or exposure has contributed to this project.
How much of my
qualification, like
you mean my like education, my business school?
Yeah.
I don't know that the well, let me say this. I mean, my business. I went to the Wharton School, so I have a business degree. And I would say my business background has helped immensely in my putting the project together. Not the research part, but the knowing how to make, when we started the Fifth Beatle, we were making it independently. I raised the money to hire an amazing artist, and we were making the book independently, and then we were going to take it to a publisher. And what happened was, we were about 20 pages in, the artwork was gorgeous, word had gotten out in the industry that we were making this book, it was Beatles related, so whenever there's something that's Beatles related, people are immediately interested. And we were in this wonderful situation where publishers were calling us. And they would say, like, are you looking for a publishing deal? And I wasn't trying to play hardball. I was just saying, actually, we're not. We're planning to make it independently, and then look for a publisher once it was done. My background when I was in the music industry was I believed in do it yourself. I always tell bands, I always tell anybody, like, don't wait around for somebody to give you a job or tell you, to help you. Like, you got to do it yourself. You got to get out there and study it yourself. For a band, make your own record. It's like today with Pro Tools, you can make a record on your computer. Don't wait for some record label to give you money. Just go ahead and do it. So that's what we were doing with the book. But my business background allowed me to have those conversations. When those publishers came to me, and I realized, like, what can you offer me now? I was able to understand deals in a way that maybe I couldn't if I had no background and was just relying on an attorney to tell me what to do. So I would say that I use my business background all the time. I mean, the getting of music rights, I mean, that was incredibly complicated. Forget about just getting the approval from the Beatles. Negotiating the deal took 6 months. So there's no question that my business background was very important to that. But in terms of the research, I wouldn't say that like the actual degree, the business degree that I got was helpful, but by going through, having a rigorous education gave me a certain work ethic I definitely learned by being at school what it means to work hard, what it means to be consistent, what it means to work hard and fail a test sometimes. You ace it sometimes, you fail sometimes. And that experience certainly served me well as I went through the trials of the research. 5 more minutes? I've got 5 more minutes.
Vivek, very confident that your book will become a bestseller just because it had the Beatles tag attached.
Was I confident about that? I definitely was not confident about that. I mean, I knew that the story was special. I'm sure you could hear in my voice and that's something I'm really passionate about. I believed that this story, if it got out, would have listeners, that people would care. So I knew the story was good. I knew the artwork was gorgeous. So I felt in my heart of hearts that it was going to do well. There's no question about that, but I felt it was going to do well. Although it's done so well, so immediately. The book came out in America on November 18th, which is right before Thanksgiving in the United States. And the New York Times bestseller charts come out on Fridays, and Thanksgiving is always on a Thursday. And I remember we talked to the publisher that week, the week it came out, and the publisher said, when we're past the Thanksgiving holiday, next week, when we get back to the office, let's sit down and we'll have a talk about the New York Times chart, and let's figure out how we can get on the chart. What can we do to help? What marketing can we do to get on the chart? In other words, there was no thought that we would be on the chart. We were going to have a meeting about how to do it. That Friday, the book debuted at number 5. It was like nobody saw that coming. And I got a call from a friend who worked in the industry saying, "Hey, congratulations on the New York Times." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" I turned my phone off for the holiday. It was like nobody saw that coming, And I grew up loving comic books. The idea of winning an Eisner Award, winning a Harvey Award, that was I never thought that would ever happen to me. It's been a real dream come true. It really has. And I'm going to reiterate it. It's been a dream come true, and I'll say it one more time. No dream is too impossible. If your dream is to write comics, you can do what I did. You can write comics and one day find yourself an Eisner winner. No dream is too impossible, and no person too unlikely to realize that dream. Please, if I can leave you with anything, that's what I want to leave you with today. Thank you. Anything else? You again. If you want to talk some more, I really will be here, so come find me.
Hi.
Hello.
I heard the new Jimi Hendrix movie did not get the music rights. How did it feel like to get? What is the process in getting the music rights? Because you mentioned another movie did not, which is going to be made about Brian Epstein, did not get rights for the Beatles music.
Yeah, it was a very long, and winding road to use a Beatles reference. The Beatles music rights. If you're a Beatles fan, you may have heard that they lost their music publishing over the years. It's owned partially by Sony ATV and partially by the Michael Jackson estate. Now, so the first thing I had to do is figure out who actually grants the rights, and I found out that, and how does it work? And that alone was a mystery to figure out how to do it. And it turns out that even though the Michael Jackson estate may still own a piece of it, it's Sony that administers it. So if you want to get the rights to the Beatles music, you really just need to go to Sony. However, if you're making a piece of entertainment, piece of media, and you want Beatles music in it, and the media, whatever it is, a commercial, a play, a film, whatever it is, doesn't have the Beatles in it, the easiest way to think about it is that the Beatles aren't in the script. Then it's still difficult, but what you need to do is you go straight to Sony, you negotiate the deal. It's a very complicated deal. You need to have a great attorney, and it's expensive, but that's what you need to do. You don't need to get the band's approval at all. If you go back and look at their films, other Beatles films like Nowhere Boy or Backbeat, if you look at these movies, there's no Beatles music in any of those movies. And that's because the Beatles never approved a project before. Because if you're doing something that the Beatles are in the script, then you have to get their permission first. And then you can go to Sony ATV. And they've literally never approved the script about their history before. So it was a real honor. But in order to do that, I literally had to get the approval of all 4, which means Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Yoko Ono, John Lennon's wife, or widow, I should say, and Olivia Harrison, George Harrison's widow. And it really is a tightrope. It's the best way I could think to describe it is I had to get all of them to like me, but no one of them to like me too much. Because if, for example, like Paul McCartney loves the book, and he wrote me that awesome letter, and I very, very specifically endeared myself to Paul McCartney about the book after I had gotten the music rights, because if Paul McCartney was as he is now, if he was a huge fan and loved my book, then Yoko Ono might have passed just because she'd be like, oh, it's a Paul project, you know? So it's a really weird thing, and if Yoko was fully behind it, Paul would say, well, it's like, you know, it's going to be too biased towards John, so I'm going to pass on it. You know, it's a really, really, it's a delicate dance you have to walk. So basically for 3 years, I reached out to everyone I knew who had some connection to any one of the four of them, to Paul, Ringo, Olivia Harrison, or Yoko. And I just got everybody to put a good word in for me. And literally one day I got an email from Jeff Jones, who runs Apple Corps, the Beatles company, and it was literally out of the blue. And he said, we've reviewed your script and we approve it. So it was just, I think, just finally enough people had been saying, he's a good guy, it's a good project, you know, you should do this. But it was a long and winding road. And ultimately, I think that the reason that they gave me the rights was because they cared about Brian. You know, you'd asked about the Fifth Beatle, did I find any opposition from? Quite the contrary. I think the Beatles are now older and away from the band for so many decades that they now really realize what Brian did for them. You know, part of the problem with Brian's management strategy of like shielding the band from the business is like, you focus on your art, I'll focus on the business. It's great for the art, but what ended up happening is after he died, they didn't appreciate what he did for them. You know, it's like Paul McCartney did say if anyone was the Fifth Beatle, it was Brian. He said that in 1999. You know, I mean, Brian died in 67. It took him 30-something years to say that. And I don't think it's because they're ungrateful. I think it's that they just didn't know. You know, they didn't appreciate what he did for them. Managers often go unappreciated because a good manager doesn't stress out their client with the business. But as a result, the client doesn't know how stressful the business is, you know? And so I think that now that they're all later in life, and Paul and Ringo have had albums that aren't huge successes, you know, some of their records are quite frankly not that great and have not sold that well. So I think now that they kind of realize how difficult the business can be, they appreciate what Brian did for them. So I think ultimately that they cared about Brian, and finally it just took forever to get them to read my book and read my script. And then when they did, they saw that I was treating Brian, you know, respectfully, but not just glowingly. It was warts and all. It had his bad sides along with his good sides. And I think they also saw in me somebody who was very passionate about the subject and also had a track record of pulling things off. You know, like I put Green Day's punk rock album, American Idiot, on the Broadway stage. I produced A Raisin in the Sun. It's a classic piece of African-American literature, and I cast Sean Combs, you know, P. Diddy as the male lead. Everybody said that was crazy, you know, African-Americans don't come to Broadway, kids don't come to Broadway. And I was like, that's ridiculous. You give them something they want to see, they'll come. You know, and the show did tremendously well. Won Felicia Rashad won Best Actress, the first time an African-American ever won Best Actress. It was awesome. And I think, like, I got the impression that the Beatles got one or the other. They either got somebody asking for the rights who was incredibly passionate but had no track record of pulling things off, or they got like big deal producers who have, you know, incredible track records, but it wasn't a labor of love for them. And quite frankly, the Beatles don't need the money. You know, they want to work with people who are passionate. So that was my impression of how it all went down. I think we're out of time. No? We're out of time. Out of time. My man Ron Mars is coming up next. So thank you guys. I will be here for a few more hours. I have a table right behind here. I'd love to talk to you some more. Random House India is selling the book. If you'd like a copy, I'd be happy to sign it. It's also available on Amazon. And if you want to stay in touch on the project, we're at fifthbeatle.com. We're also on Facebook at The Fifth Beatle, and we're on Twitter at Fifth Beatle. I'm personally also on Twitter at Vivek J. Tiwary, and I'm also on Facebook. And I'm going to say it one final time, in case you missed it. The message of the Brian Epstein story, and the one thing I want to leave you with, again, is that no dream is too impossible and no person too unlikely to realize that dream. I beg you to believe. Thank you so much.
Hyderabad, a big round of applause for